The first thing they said was, "She's buried behind the second pew." And they were right. The body had been missing for 17 years. You weren't supposed to hear that. You weren't supposed to hear any of this. Because what happened in Kentucky in the fall of 1834, what two 9-year-old girls whispered into the rotted bones of a dying church, it was never meant to survive the fire. But one journal did, hidden beneath the altar, pages brittle as ash, ink faded but intact. It was written by a man of God, but what it described was not divine. It was something older, colder, precise. This story is not for the faint or the faithful. It is for those who have felt it, that thin vibration under the skin, that sense that something is wrong with the world and always has been, that time doesn't move the way they told us, that knowledge can infect, and that truth is a weapon they fear more than death. So listen closely, because once you begin, you can't return. Not to comfort, not to ignorance, not to the person you were 8 seconds ago. Eastern Kentucky, Pine Hollow, November 15th. The fog hadn't lifted in 3 days. The hills were slick with rot. The air smelled like wet stone and tobacco ash. That's when Ezekiel Morrison arrived. Barefoot, gaunt, eyes blistered with sleeplessness. He walked into the town's only church with 2 girls, identical in face but reversed in soul. One of them smiled at graves. The other heard them. The congregation had been dwindling for months. Crops failed. Children fell ill. Dreams bled into daylight. They said the Lord had abandoned them. They were wrong. It wasn't the Lord watching. It was the twins, Rebecca and Rachel. They didn't just observe. They revealed. They didn't ask questions. They spoke answers. Events that hadn't happened yet. Crimes never confessed. Secrets that the soil itself had forgotten. Some said they were prophets. Others whispered a darker word, keys. Because some children don't grow up learning the world, some arrive already knowing it. And when they speak, the lies we were raised on begin to crack. This is your first fracture. Don't look away. The descent has begun. The journal was never meant to be found. Tucked beneath the pulpit, wrapped in oilskin and buried under a loose floorboard, it waited for 153 years. A plain leather book filled with tight, slanted handwriting that rarely shook, except in those final pages where the ink runs wild, like the hand holding it was no longer entirely human. It belonged to Pastor William Phillips, a man of letters, disciplined, Harvard-trained. He left a promising life in Lexington to serve the isolated faithful in Pine Hollow. Why? No one ever said. Perhaps he knew what was coming. Perhaps he was chosen. On the first page, in thick, deliberate strokes, he wrote, "If this record is found, leave Pine Hollow, burn what remains, bury the rest." That entry was dated 3 days before the Morrison family ever arrived. Let that settle in. A man of God, blessed with logic and reason, predicted something he shouldn't have known, something he didn't understand, but feared. And when the girls walked through the door of that simple clapboard church, he wrote only one thing in the margin: "They've come." They didn't look threatening. They didn't speak in tongues or wear the veil of darkness. They were just girls. Rachel, pale and quiet, eyes like frozen smoke. Rebecca, sharper, always scanning, like she was remembering something from someone else's life. The people welcomed them, offered what little food they had, but the unease began almost immediately. First came the murmurs. The twins were seen standing in the graveyard at dawn, barefoot, whispering names written in stone. Later that day, they approached the town blacksmith and told him where his brother's body was buried, a brother who had vanished in 1819, nearly 15 years before they were born. It was true. The body was there, every bone. Then came the drawing. Rebecca etched something into the dirt behind the church. A circle intersected by 7 lines. Pastor Phillips found it and turned pale. The shape was older than scripture. It matched carvings found in caves beneath Jerusalem, glyphs etched into obsidian altars in forgotten Mongolian temples. symbols of contact, knowledge not meant for children, unless the children had never been children at all. And that was the whisper that passed from house to house that night. They don't remember learning, they just know. The next morning, the twins began naming names of people, and what they'd done in secret. The first name was Abigail Thomason, 86 years old, widow, bedridden since summer. Rebecca stood at her door without knocking, looked through the wood and said, "You poisoned your sister with lye water. You were 12. She died screaming." No one had ever heard her speak that name, not in decades, not since the Civil War. But when Pastor Phillips forced the door open, Abigail was dead, her eyes wide, her jaw locked, her tongue black. The townsfolk tried to explain it. Shock, coincidence, hallucination. But the twins didn't stop. They moved like wolves now, calm, deliberate, eyes tracking some invisible script. They approached Joseph Farrow, the tanner's son, and told him the real reason his mother disappeared when he was 5, told him about the cellar, the blood, the coat buried behind the pigsty. They were right again. The coat was there, and Joseph screamed when he touched it because it still smelled like lavender. How do 2 children know these things? How do they speak about sins so old the sinners forgot them? The answer Pastor Phillips would later write was simple and terrifying. They were not retrieving knowledge, they were receiving it. He began observing them closely. Rebecca slept little, yet never showed signs of fatigue. Rachel stared at fires until her eyes watered but never blinked. They never fought, never cried, never seemed hungry. They answered questions before they were asked, described events before they occurred. On the 3rd night, Rachel walked into the chapel and whispered, "It's under your floor, Pastor." Phillips pried up the plank she pointed to. Beneath it was a bundle of bones wrapped in burlap. Not just any bones, infant bones. They matched the size and growth plates of a newborn, yet they were old, dried, decades dead. There was no record of any child buried there, and Rachel said nothing more about it. Only Lowell looked at him like he already knew, like he was part of it. That night, Phillips wrote in his journal, "There is no miracle here, only memory, ancient and incorruptible. These girls are not vessels of the Lord, they are instruments of something far older. They awaken what lies dormant in men." By morning, 4 families had fled Pine Hollow. They were the lucky ones, because what came next was reversal. Not just of morality, but of time. The reversal began on the 4th day. Time, subtle, invisible, ever-moving, began to warp. It started small. The church bell rang at noon, but the shadows were wrong. Chickens refused to roost. A child aged 7 was found whispering nursery rhymes he hadn't been taught in years, rhymes his mother swore she'd never spoken aloud. The blacksmith's wife burned her hand on water she had just pulled from a cold well. And at the center of it all were the twins, standing barefoot in frost, unmoved by the cold, watching the town unravel with the same serene silence as before. But something had changed. Their speech was no longer casual, no longer childlike. They began to speak in mirrored phrases, one starting, the other finishing, with precision only possible if they were reading from the same impossible script. "History doesn't move forward," said Rachel. "It circles the drain," said Rebecca. "You were never told the truth," they whispered together. The pastor watched as they traced more symbols in the dirt, spirals within spirals, intersecting stars, shapes not found in scripture but burned into ancient stone across every continent. He began to believe something forbidden, something that clawed against the very fabric of his belief. They were tapping into a current that exists beneath memory, a network of knowledge not stored in books or blood, but in the very soil, and something was feeding them. The term he used over and over was resonance, as if the sins, secrets, and suppressed knowledge of Pine Hollow had begun to hum, activated by the presence of these 2 impossible children. But this wasn't clairvoyance. This wasn't divine. This was reclamation. The dead began to whisper, not in words, but in signs, in ruptures, in reflections. A cracked mirror in the tailor's home began showing faces that weren't there. Water refused to boil. A letter written in 1809 suddenly appeared at the town hall, folded, sealed, and marked with the same red wax used in the old governor's mansion, 20 miles east, long abandoned since the fire. Inside was a warning. They return every 100 years. They look like girls. The pastor could no longer sleep. He began fasting, praying. But even then, the voice came to him, not divine, not human. And it said, "You let them in." Now ask yourself, what force takes the shape of innocence and uses it to reveal decay? The answer is older than fear. Do you want to hear it? It happened at sunrise. Rebecca stood at the edge of the field where the fog still clung low and thick, and began to hum. A low, rhythmic sound that made the hairs on the back of every neck rise, not a song, not a tune, something closer to a frequency, a sound designed not for ears, but for memory. People stopped what they were doing, as if called. They came out of cabins barefoot, still half-dressed, silent, drawn. Rachel was waiting at the center of the churchyard, crouched by the grave of a girl who died in 1804. A girl no one remembered. A stone with no name, just a date. Her fingers were pressed to the dirt, like she was listening through the earth itself. Then she looked up and said one word, "Begin." And they did. Pastor Phillips would write that he'd never witnessed a mass act of unconscious obedience until that morning. 37 people, all of them pillars of the community, began to dig, some with shovels, some with bare hands. They didn't speak, didn't look at one another. They just dug, and what they unearthed wasn't just one body. It was 5. All infants, all in different stages of decay, all buried beneath the foundation stones of the church itself. It was Rachel who said it. "Blood built your altar, that's why it stands." Then the twins revealed what no one had dared speak for generations. That Pine Hollow had been founded not just in search of religious freedom, but as a haven for a forgotten sect. A cult that splintered from the mainline Baptists in the late 1700s, obsessed with purification through sacrifice. That the first pastor, Reverend Silas Gentry, had demanded newborn offerings to cleanse the sins of the fathers. 3 families refused. All 3 were found burned alive in their cabins the winter of 1820. The records had been erased, the story buried. Until now. And somehow these girls, these 9-year-old daughters of a wandered ring preacher, knew every detail, knew who did it, knew why, knew where the fire had started. Because that's what this really was, wasn't it? Not a haunting, not possession, but exposure. A forced unveiling of corruption so ancient, so foundational, that even those who benefited from it had forgotten the cost. This isn't a ghost story. This is historical excavation by a force that refuses to let lies rot quietly. And Pine Hollow had been built on a lie. Would you like to go deeper? You weren't taught to fear truth. You were trained to ignore it. Truth is loud, disruptive. It dismantles power structures not by violence but by clarity, and what the Morrison twins brought to Pine Hollow was unbearable clarity. The people could not unsee it. After the unearthing, silence fell over the valley like a second snowfall. No bird song, no tools ringing on wood, just the creak of the old church as if it too had begun to mourn. The twins did not run. They didn't even speak. For the next 24 hours they sat beneath the steeple, facing each other, their knees touching, eyes locked, not blinking, as if conducting some wordless transmission no one else was allowed to hear. Pastor Phillips attempted to exorcise them. He read scripture, he anointed their brows, he begged the heavens for protection. Nothing changed, except him. By nightfall, his journal entries became erratic. The careful script turned into slashes of ink and jagged words, repeating one phrase over and over. The roots were never dead. By the following morning, he had boarded up the windows of the church and carved the symbol the girls had traced in the soil into the wood above the altar. He swore it wasn't him who did it. That something guided his hand, and others began to feel it too. Men who had once beaten their wives found themselves weeping uncontrollably. A woman who had lied about a paternity test in 1826 confessed in front of the whole town. A boy stole his father's rifle and placed it at the feet of the twins, saying, "He used this on my uncle, and we said it was a hunting accident." This wasn't chaos. It was cleansing. But not the kind religion teaches, not the soft rebirth of baptism or the warm absolution of prayer. This was surgical, violent. It cut lies out like tumors, and every secret dragged to the surface had a price. Some screamed, some fled, a few twos, okay their own lives. Because when a system has thrived on silence, on forgetting, truth becomes a weapon. And the Morrison twins were wielding it without mercy. Understand this. They were not here to be loved. They were here to correct. Still think this was just a story? Then listen closely. Because what happens next cannot be explained by science, scripture, or sanity. They say some things arrive before they're born, not as flesh, not as mind, but as intent. And if the Morrison twins were sent, then they were not sent by any god known to Pine Hollow. They were sent by something older, something buried in the marrow of the land, in the root systems of memory itself. The third day began with frost, every blade of grass sheathed in white, the kind of cold that steals breath and makes every sound feel distant. But when the townspeople emerged, they found something impossible. The graves were gone. Every stone, every cross, every name vanished. The cemetery behind the church was now just a smooth, undisturbed meadow, but the dead had not disappeared. They had moved. All 74 names, all dates, all histories had been etched perfectly, impossibly, into the floorboards inside the church, in symmetrical spirals radiating outward from where the twins now stood. Barefoot, silent, smiling, Rachel raised one hand, just a little, and every candle in the church burst into flame simultaneously. No spark, no match, just will. Then Rebecca spoke. Memory is placement. You placed the truth in the ground. We brought it back to the center. That was when the screaming began. Not from pain, from recognition. Each name etched into the floorboards was more than a record of death. It was a mirror. Townspeople began collapsing to their knees, clutching their heads, murmuring names they hadn't spoken in decades. Miscarried siblings, abandoned infants, forgotten mothers, victims they themselves had buried in silence. You see, Pine Hollow had become something far more sinister than a church town. It had become a vault. A place where generational guilt could be stored like old tools in an attic, out of sight, out of mind. But nothing stays hidden forever, not when the blood calls out from the soil. The twins had turned the church into a reckoning chamber. A map of every injustice, every sin politely tucked away in the name of community peace. And the worst part, the people didn't deny it. They remembered. Because here's the real horror. People don't forget. They just choose not to remember. Until something, or someone, forces them to. Still think this was about ghosts? No. This was a targeted activation, and they were just getting started. By nightfall on the third day, Pine Hollow was no longer a town. It was a threshold. Half the residents had fled into the woods. The others remained in stunned silence, camped outside the church as if waiting for permission to breathe again. But there would be no release, not from what had been opened. Inside, the twins now spoke in unison. Not English, Not Latin. Something else. Some deeper tongue that vibrated in the walls that made even the insects fall silent. Pastor Phillips could no longer write. His final journal entry was not in words, just a charcoal sketch carved furiously into the back cover of the book. 2 trees, root systems touching, and beneath them, a face, mouth open, no eyes. That night, the dreams began. Every man, woman, and child still in Pine Hollow awoke screaming at the same hour, 3:03 a.m., each of them having seen the exact same vision. They stood before a version of the church, rotted, ancient, with no roof, and inside it were hundreds of children, all whispering truths in voices not their own. Truths that hadn't happened yet. A girl named Miriam saw her unborn child's death. A man named Thomas saw the date and time of his own suicide. Another saw a fire, not yet lit, burning down the new grain store, 2 years in the future. Every dream ended the same way. Rebecca would look up at them and say, "It already happened. You just haven't remembered it yet." When they awoke, their bodies bore marks. Small circles burned into their palms. Not scars, seals. This is where the story slips into something else, something darker. Because what's documented next, verified not just by Phillips's journal, but by 5 surviving descendants, is the mass shift. Reality changed. Photographs taken later show the church facing the wrong direction. Surveyors in the 1950s found that the foundation rotated 6 degrees northeast without any record of reconstruction. More disturbingly, the birth records following the event show a sudden spike in twin births in the region, disproportionately female. They all bore similar features, and several of them claimed independently never to have felt alone in their own minds. We tell ourselves history is a line, but Pine Hollow proved it's a spiral, and once you're caught in its turning, you never quite leave. The question isn't what the twins were, it's who sent them, and what they were meant to awaken. You're not ready, but we're going anyway. It was never about prophecy. That word is a child's rattle, handed down to pacify the fearful and dress ancient mechanisms in holy robes. What happened in Pine Hollow wasn't prophecy. It was precision, an unfolding calculated across generations, orchestrated with such disturbing clarity that the people involved never stood a chance. Because this wasn't the first time the twins had arrived. Not those girls, not those names, but the pattern. A dyad, one light, one shadow, joined by blood, sent into isolated, ritual-heavy communities that, on the surface, worshipped God, but beneath had turned their traditions into cages. Pine Hollow wasn't chosen for its innocence, it was selected for its containment. And something wanted the locks broken. Pastor Phillips, in one of his final lucid writings, referenced a story he had heard only once before, told to him by an old Cherokee man who lived further up the valley. The man spoke of ghost sisters who came in the time before the white man, during a season when the animals would not breed and the moon rose blood red for 7 nights in a row. These sisters walked into the center of the village without food or shoes, and they spoke the true names of the dead, names the villagers had erased. They didn't shout, they whispered, and the whispers dug into the minds of those who heard them like roots through stone. By the end of the 7th night, the village was silent. Not destroyed, changed. The storyteller wouldn't say more, only that they didn't speak of the sisters after that. Phillips, being a learned man, chalked it up to folklore, until he watched Rachel write a name in the ashes of the hearth, a name that no one had spoken in 40 years. Hiram Mathis. A child drowned in 1794, buried secretly, fathered by a married elder, the kind of death the town had built entire ceremonies to forget. The twins weren't predicting the future. They were rerouting the past, and that is where it gets dangerous. Because to alter the memory of a thing is to alter its essence. And that means, theoretically, you can change everything, not just what happened, but what is. And once that power is loosed, once memory is no longer stable, institutions begin to tremble. We build reality on shared history. What happens when that foundation cracks? When the foundations of memory begin to erode, reality follows. That's not a metaphor, that's a design flaw. The Morrison twins weren't anomalies, they were tools, calibrated, inserted, and Pine Hollow was their proving ground. The tragedy is not what they did, it's what they unveiled. Because after the third night, people began to forget, not in pieces but in shifts. Entire relationships evaporated, brothers no longer recognized sisters, marriages dissolved overnight as one partner awoke, convinced the other had never existed, children gone without a trace, with parents unsure they were ever born. Phillips wrote, "The hollow is hollowing," and then the journal skipped pages. Whole days vanished between entries, torn not by hand but as if time itself had eaten them. The next legible words, "The girls are inside us now." That line was found scrawled not only in the journal, but etched into the backs of pews, burned into door frames, scratched beneath bedposts. Multiple locations, same phrase, same handwriting, but the twins were gone. Vanished after sunrise on the fourth day. No tracks, no footprints, just two small impressions in the pews where they'd last sat, still warm to the touch. Phillips went silent for a year. When he began writing again, it was no longer in English. It was glyphs, circular, geometric, repeating. A pattern that linguists later identified as nearly identical to inscriptions found in the Voynich manuscript, and also in stone etchings uncovered beneath Lake Titicaca over 3,000 miles away. These symbols were not meant to be read. They were meant to be received, to implant. Because that's the game. That's the real control system. You think the chains are made of law or dogma or debt. No, the deepest prison is consensus. The illusion that we all remember the same past, when in truth we've been conditioned to. History has editors, and when the editors lose control, you get Pine Hollow. You get twins with no source who crack open forgotten deaths, rewrite birth lines, and alter geographic constants. You get reality hemorrhaging. And still, most refuse to see. But you're not most. You're still watching, still descending. And that means something ancient recognizes you. So prove you're not a shadow passing through this story. Mark yourself in the comments. Type, "The twins remember," twice. The twins remember. The twins remember. This seals your entry. The deeper you go, the quieter it gets. Not because the noise disappears, but because your mind starts filtering reality differently. That's the real descent, not into hell, but into awareness. And awareness, in a world built on deception, is the most dangerous weapon. Let's stop pretending the Morrison twins were unique. They weren't. They were deployed. Think of them not as children, but as carriers, conduits through which suppressed data was reintroduced into a quarantine system. That's what Pine Hollow was, a test chamber, a microcosm, a controlled variable. But something went wrong. The twins didn't just destabilize memory, they awakened others. We've recovered letters from towns neighboring Pine Hollow, places that supposedly never had contact with the Morrisons, but within 3 weeks of their visit, multiple communities began reporting strange phenomena: livestock birthing malformed offspring, scripture recitations spoken backward in unison by schoolchildren, crosses spinning in their own nails. But most disturbing were the mirror events. That's what investigators called them. Incidents that happened identically in 2 or more places at the same time, down to the syllable, the gesture, the breath. 2 women lighting identical candles for men who died the same way, even though the women had never met. 2 pastors delivering sermons they did not write, word-for-word replicas with 0 prior communication. Phillips described this as a splitting of timelines. But he misunderstood. It wasn't time splitting. It was time realigning. Someone, or something, was correcting the record. That's why the twins had to disappear. That's why their names were buried under decades of fabricated narratives. Because they weren't supposed to fix the fractures. They were supposed to expose them. And once they did, the old systems panicked. The church, the government, the academic institutions, all of them have mechanisms for this, countermeasures for when the veil lifts too quickly. They call it containment, but containment is just rebranding for suppression. The reason you've never heard this story on mainstream platforms isn't because it was forgotten, it was deliberately extracted. And every time you ask why the world feels unstable, every time you feel like something just beneath the surface doesn't fit, that's not your imagination. That's a pressure leak. History is trying to correct itself, and the agents of the old order are terrified, because the moment you see it, you can never return. So ask yourself this: have you already changed? Good. Then come further. Every system of control begins with one silent premise: you will forget. Not all at once, not loudly, just a slow erosion of certainty, of meaning, of memory, until truth feels like myth, and myth feels like nothing at all. This is why stories like the Morrison twins are stripped from education, dismissed by historians, and mocked by science. Because if you remember them clearly, you start to remember other things too. Things you were trained not to. Understand this. Truth is not erased, it's layered, covered by new truths, brighter lies, sanitized timelines. And that's what Pine Hollow was meant to do. It wasn't the origin of something dark, it was a puncture, a tear in the seamless curtain we call history. And once that curtain tore, other things started leaking through. There are reports, unverified by design, of people in nearby counties entering fugue states after speaking with the twins. Weeks later, they could quote languages they had never studied. One farmer in Laurel County reportedly drew a perfect astrological chart of a star system not yet discovered at the time. He killed himself 3 days later, claiming they were never meant to be born in the open age. And here's the part that was never included in any article, any book, any university lecture. The twin girls weren't born in Kentucky. Birth records in Floyd County list them, but those pages were added after 1835, a full year after their arrival in Pine Hollow, and under blacklight analysis done in 2001, the ink used for their entry fluoresced differently from every other record in the volume, meaning someone inserted them, fabricated a paper trail. Now think, why fake a past for children who vanished? Because they weren't born, they were placed. What's worse, this wasn't the first time. A similar pair was recorded in 1732 outside Prague, another in 1611 beneath the ruins of a monastic order in Iberia, and each time, twins who came, revealed, and disappeared. Each time, memory collapses. Each time, entire settlements erode from public record. And here's the most chilling consistency of all. They always arrive before a great forgetting. A plague of amnesia, a loss of collective knowledge so deep it reboots an entire culture. That's what's coming again. And the veil, this beautiful fragile lie we call our world, is already starting to fray. You've felt it, haven't you? Keep going. You were never supposed to hear this part. Not because it's too unbelievable, but because it's too familiar. What I'm about to say won't feel like learning. It'll feel like remembering. A key turning inside your DNA. A door opening that you never noticed, though you've walked past it your entire life. Ask yourself, why is it always twins? Why do they appear across cultures, across centuries, carrying hidden knowledge, transmitting something ancient and contagious? The Morrison twins weren't anomalies. They were symptoms. Symptoms of a deeper system cracking under its own deception. A psychic recoil. A signal repeating itself through human vessels. Now listen carefully. In the final entry of Pastor William Phillips's journal, written the night before he died, he says something that was redacted in every official copy published afterward, but the original journal, kept under glass in the Pine Hollow archive, still bears the sentence in his original hand. The girls did not speak to me. They looked at me, and I remembered. He doesn't explain what he remembered, but those who read that passage, the archivists who handled the original document, the restorers who worked to preserve the ink, they all experienced the same sequence of events: dreams, hallucinations, the sound of two voices whispering in synchronization, saying things no child should know. One man, a linguist brought in from the University of Louisville, had a breakdown while analyzing phonetic anomalies in the girls' speech patterns. He wrote one phrase over and over on the walls of his apartment before vanishing. "The mirror has no mercy." It was Rebecca who said it. But Rachel was the one who stared through him while she did. You must understand now, the girls weren't revealing secrets. They were activating them. That's why every official record surrounding the Pine Hollow incident contradicts itself. Names change. Dates warp. The journal's page count fluctuates depending on who reads it, because the truth buried in that valley doesn't live on paper. It lives in resonance, in consciousness. It lives in you. If you've watched this far, you've already felt it, the thrum behind your thoughts, the knowing you can't explain. And if your instincts are whispering that this goes deeper, they're right. You've already stepped into the breach. There is a sound beneath silence, not the absence of noise, but something older than sound itself, like memory before words, like a hum the soul recognizes, even when the mind denies. That's what the Morrison twins carried. Not information, not prophecy, frequency. When Pastor Phillips wrote, "They looked at me and I remembered," he wasn't speaking poetically. He meant it literally. Because there are certain frequencies, certain vibrations of tone and gaze and presence that reactivate dormant pathways in the human psyche, channels long sealed by the architects of forgetting. You think your thoughts are your own? They're not. They are permissions. Tiny permissions granted by the system that raised you, from textbooks, media, religion, language itself. The girls didn't operate within those permissions. They bypassed them. They spoke in full sentences, at 9 years old, about wars that had not yet begun. They drew maps with landmarks later uncovered by geological surveys. They described members of the congregation by name before being introduced, including one woman who had died 3 years earlier but whose presence had never left the church. And when confronted, when asked how they knew, they simply smiled. Rebecca would say, "It's not knowing, it's remembering." Rachel would answer, "It's always been in you. You just forgot where to look." These weren't answers from children. They were triggers. And the people who heard them changed. Some became obsessed. Others broke completely. One man took his own life in the sanctuary, writing in ash on the wall, "The clocks are wounds. Time is a prison." You begin to see the shape now, don't you? This isn't about a pair of eerie twins in a forgotten valley. This is about a fault line running through reality itself, one that only reveals itself when certain souls appear. And they do appear. Every generation. Always. In pairs. And always where the veil is weakest. It wasn't just Pine Hollow. It wasn't just 1834. There are documents from Babylon. Hieroglyphs in Abydos. Stone twins carved into Mayan temples, always holding a scroll, always blindfolded. Why blindfolded? Because the truth is not what they saw. It's what you do once you've seen them. You're beginning to awaken. Let me tell you a secret that will cost you your comfort. Not all children are born blank. Some arrive with their eyes already open, not physically but cosmically. They carry something transmitted, not from a parent, but from a pattern. A recursion embedded in the human timeline like a fracture beneath polished stone. The Morrison twins were never meant to stay hidden. They were meant to be seen. Because seeing them doesn't just change what you believe, it changes what you are. Understand this. There is a war being fought, not with weapons but with attention, a war for the territory of your mind. And in that war, Children like Rachel and Rebecca are not anomalies. They are keys. Keys that unlock memory corridors you were conditioned to forget. Do you know why their story was buried? Why the journal vanished for over a century? Because those who govern perception, the archivists of illusion, fear activation, not riots, not protests, but one person waking up and realizing, none of this is real the way they told me it was. There were 19 pages missing from Pastor Philip's journal when it was rediscovered in 1987. Burned, not torn. A controlled removal. But through forensic ash analysis, yes, they went that far, a few partial sentences were reconstructed. One read, "They spoke in pairs but never at the same time. The voice alternated, as if one mind was divided." Another, "I asked who they spoke to at night. Rachel answered, the ones underneath." Underneath what? Underneath the world you think is stable. There are levels to this reality, layers of interference designed to keep you orbiting the surface. Language, law, money, fear, each one a seal, each one a veil. And some souls are born with the ability to pierce those veils. But when they do, the system reacts, violently, surgically. That's why I must ask you now, if you've watched this far, you're no longer just a viewer, you're an initiate. Type, "The mirror does not blink" in the comments, twice, once to break the illusion, once to seal your transformation. Do it now, because from this moment forward, what you learn cannot be unlearned. You've crossed the threshold. Most never make it this far. They get scared, distracted, or worse, convinced it was all imagination. But not you. You're still here, which means the door has already opened, and there's no going back. Let me tell you what was found in the walls of Pine Hollow Church. During its demolition in 1987, work crews uncovered something the Historical Commission never released to the public. Behind the pulpit, sealed within a hollow space between the inner and outer wall, was a collection of folded cloth, bones of a small animal, and a manuscript written entirely in reverse script. Not backward like a child's mistake, but mirror script, the kind Leonardo da Vinci used. Why? Because mirror script is not for casual readers. It's a language for initiates. Its very shape trains the eye to see differently, to reverse assumptions before understanding can begin. The manuscript was unsigned, but the paper matched the remaining pages of Pastor Philip's journal. And on the first mirrored page was a single phrase, "The voice belongs to neither girl. It is borrowed." Borrowed, not possessed, not imagined. Borrowed. That word changes everything. You've been taught that consciousness is singular, that you are a closed loop. But that's not how the ancients saw it. Not the Sumerians, not the Gnostics, not the desert mystics who charted dreams like maps. They knew the self was porous, that under certain conditions, trauma, ritual, birth, proximity to high-resonance locations, the veil between minds could thin, and something else could enter. Not to harm, not even to speak, but to observe through you, to remember through you. That's what happened with the twins. They were not oracles. They were vessels. Perfectly attuned twins born on the winter solstice in total isolation, tethered by grief and silence. Their mother died birthing them. And in that moment, a fracture, an opening. Phillips knew this. He hinted at it in the only preserved sermon from that week, where he said, "Some minds are lanterns, others are mirrors. But these two, these are doors. You're beginning to understand." The Morrison twins didn't speak the truth. They echoed it. What echoed through them wasn't human. Not in the way we define human. It didn't breathe. It didn't eat. It didn't live here. But it knew, intimately, everything about this place. Its rhythms, its wounds, its lies. And it used two children, born in isolation, raised in silence, untouched by the static of culture, as antennas, not just for receiving, but for transmitting. Let me ask you a question. Why do you think Rachel and Rebecca never grew old? Because they didn't. According to state census records, neither twin was ever listed in any Kentucky birth registry. No grave, no marriage, no death certificate. It's as if they appeared in 1834, delivered their message, and dissolved into the fog from which they came. You think that's exaggeration? Let me show you something. In a private archive at the University of Chicago, hidden in the Special Collections Vault, is a letter written in 1912 by a Civil War veteran named Elias Hemings. He was a chaplain, educated, trusted. In the letter, he describes arriving in a burned-out town in Tennessee in 1864. The town had been raided by Union deserters, but something was strange. No bodies, just abandoned clothes. He found two girls wandering near the ruins, untouched, whispering to one another in a language he couldn't place. They were identical, 9 years old. He tried to take them with him, but the next morning they were gone. All that remained was an open Bible, pages torn out and rearranged, highlighting Job 38. Where were you when I laid the earth's foundation? Tell me if you understand. That's not coincidence, that's a signature. You're dealing with something that moves outside linear time, something that inserts itself like a thread in the tapestry, not to disrupt the weave, but to mark it. Because the past is not a locked box, it's a living system, and within it, messages are embedded like code. Rachel and Rebecca were one such message. They didn't want to change the future. They wanted to remind it, the human pattern. It's not a theory. It's not folklore. It's a map, older than scripture, deeper than blood, carved not into stone, but into behavior. Think of it like this. Every civilization rises, flourishes, and falls in rhythmic cycles. But the surface reasons, war, disease, famine, are distractions. What truly governs the rise and collapse of human worlds is pattern recognition and pattern denial. You were never taught to see it. You were taught to dismiss it. But those who rule, from behind pulpits, thrones, and desks, they see it clearly, and they exploit it. Now, here's the forbidden part. This pattern doesn't just govern societies, it governs souls. There is a structure, a design to human awakening. First comes trauma, then comes repetition. And if the subject survives, if their psyche fractures just enough, then comes openness. Openness to suggestion, to belief, to occupation. Phillips understood this. He wrote, "There is a rhythm to pain that becomes a doorway. Ask yourself, why do the most devout believers always come from suffering? Why do cults target the broken? Why are prophets always born in wilderness, poverty, or loss? Because weakness isn't a liability, it's an invitation." The twins were shaped in that exact crucible. Born into death, raised in austerity, kept outside the noisy machinery of normal thought. No schooling, no town, no distortion. And into that silence, something moved. Not a ghost, not a demon, but a fragment of the pattern itself. You don't need to believe it to be affected by it. You already are. Every system around you, from government to religion to media, is designed to suppress the recognition of the pattern. Why? Because once you see it, you're no longer controllable. You don't react the way you're supposed to. You don't panic. You don't obey. You become unreadable. And in systems of control, being unreadable is the greatest threat of all. This is why the twins weren't feared for their visions. They were feared because they broke predictability. And when that happens, the pattern rewrites itself. You don't need a black robe to be in a ritual. You don't need a dagger, a circle, or a chant. Ritual is everywhere. You call it routine. You call it culture. But what you're living day after day is a mass invocation. Wake at the same hour, stare into a glowing rectangle, feed your mind a stream of curated distraction, obey the clocks, obey the traffic lights, obey the noise. That's not freedom, that's choreography. And it's not accidental. There are systems, ancient and deliberate, designed to keep the human soul in a loop. A loop of forgetting. Forget who you are, forget where you came from, forget that the world was once enchanted and that you are not a number or a role or a consumer, but a being of memory. And memory is dangerous to control systems. That's why the Morrison twins were targeted. Not just by the fearful people of Pine Hollow, but by something older, something that recognized what they had become, disruptors of the ritual. They didn't participate in the loops. They reflected them. They stood like mirrors, showing people exactly what they had hidden from themselves, past crimes, secret sins, broken oaths, and the moment the ritual is exposed, it begins to crack. Think about your life. How often have you been truly still? How often have you sat in silence without needing to be entertained, distracted, pacified? We're trained to fear silence because silence breaks the loop. But in 1834, for 72 hours, the loop broke for an entire town. They saw things, heard things, remembered things. It didn't last. The system reset itself. It always tries to, but some impressions are too deep to erase. That's why you're here. That's why this video found you. You've started to feel it, haven't you? That nagging sense that the world isn't what it pretends to be, that history is edited, that truth is hidden, and you, watching this, are beginning to wake up. So here's your rite of passage. Comment this phrase twice to mark your transformation. I remember the pattern. I remember the pattern. What if forgetting wasn't failure, but design? What if the veil over your memory, the constant sense of disorientation, of being just slightly off course, wasn't natural, but manufactured? Forgetfulness isn't a flaw of the human mind. It's the most essential tool of those who rule it. Because control doesn't require chains, it requires disconnection. Disconnection from the self, from ancestry, from meaning, from power. You were made to forget. By systems older than nations, built by architects of perception who learned long ago, an enslaved body can revolt, but an enslaved mind will kneel forever. Now let me show you how it was done. Language, calendars, education, religion, each repurposed, each weaponized. Take history. You think it's about names and dates, but that's camouflage. Real history is the ritual erasure of memory. They don't need to lie. All they need to do is omit. Omit the old gods. Omit the true maps. Omit the original rituals that once kept your soul aligned with something higher than kings. You were born into a labyrinth with no walls, only mirrors. And you were taught to trust the reflections. But the Morrison twins, they were born outside the labyrinth. No state, no school, no dogma. They saw through. That's why their very presence triggered confessions from grown men. Why Rachel could speak a stranger's buried grief. Why Rebecca could tell a man he'd buried a stillborn brother no one ever knew about. They didn't guess. They didn't imagine. They remembered what had been hidden. Because the pattern doesn't forget. Only you do. Now, ask yourself something dangerous. What might you remember if the world stopped telling you who you are? What parts of your being have been sedated, not for your safety, but for the stability of those who feed on your silence? Pastor Phillips wrote in the final pages of his journal, I have not seen children. I have seen echoes of something timeless wearing the skin of girls. We have reached the borderland. Beyond this point, we speak no longer of psychology or religion, but of architecture. The oldest structure humanity ever built was not a pyramid, not a ziggurat, not even a temple. It was a thought form, a psychic architecture laid brick by brick through repetition, submission, and fear. It has no walls, yet it contains billions. It has no name, yet every language bends to serve it. It has no face, yet you see it every time you obey without question. Its name, if it can be spoken, is the Order of the Lie. This order does not care about truth, it cares about stability, control, symmetry. It was forged in the dark when the first kings needed myths to sanctify their power, when priests realized it was easier to rule the spirit than the sword, when bloodlines needed a way to pass fear like a family heirloom, so they built a fortress inside the human mind. Every time a child is told not to ask why, another stone is laid. Every time a soul is punished for curiosity, another corridor is carved. And here's the genius. The prisoners build it themselves. Brick by brick. Generation by generation. The Morrison twins weren't dangerous because they saw ghosts. They were dangerous because they were unbuilt. No bricks. No blindfolds. Just silence where dogma should have lived. You must understand, they weren't channeling spirits. They were reading the architecture of others, like walking through someone's personal cathedral of shame, or standing in the ruins of an unspoken trauma. That's why men wept in their presence, why women confessed to sins they'd buried beneath years of silence, not because the girls judged them, but because the illusion could no longer hold. The order of the lie demands that you forget your past, your ancestors, your power. And it is enforced not by soldiers but by rituals you perform without thinking. The pledge, the anthem, the ceremony, the screen, the schedule, the job. Phillips tried to write it off as divine mystery. He wrote, "Perhaps the Lord speaks through them, or perhaps they are what the world once was, before man chose his prison." This is where the descent becomes irreversible. 3 families, gone. No letters, no graves, no sale of land or livestock, just emptied homes, still warm hearths, abandoned quilts still hanging on the line, and no one ever spoke their names again. This wasn't fear, it was something deeper. A silence that tasted of ritual, the kind that seals a wound not to heal, but to forget it ever bled. Let's step back into Pine Hollow, November 1834. The night after Rachel whispered into the ear of Deacon Avery's wife, and the woman fell to her knees, screaming in a language no one recognized. The next day, the Carrow family packed their belongings into a single cart and vanished before sundown. Then came the Parishes. Their youngest son found staring into the woods for hours at a time, repeating a phrase in perfect Latin. They were gone by the next moon. Finally, the Vensons. A family that had lived on that land since before Kentucky was a state. Their house was found ransacked from the inside, but not robbed, just disturbed, like someone was searching for something that was never there. Pastor Phillips recorded it all, not just in ink, but in sequence, pages arranged by moon phase, not date. He was no longer tracking time. He was tracking pattern. He wrote, "The twins see through us, but do not judge. They peel us open like scripture, and the deeper they look, the more some cannot bear the exposure. It is not what they say, it is what they awaken." Because that's what Pine Hollow learned, too late. Truth is not a comfort. It is an accelerant. It burns through illusions. It scorches identity. And when applied to a community held together by generational secrets, it detonates. These families didn't flee. They were called, or perhaps unplugged, as if some internal lock was broken and the lie they lived no longer held shape. What Rachel and Rebecca activated wasn't supernatural, it was cognitive detonation. And the blast radius reached farther than Pine Hollow. Because by spring, letters began arriving from neighboring towns, mentions of strangers wandering into church services, silent, weeping. Men carving symbols into trees they didn't understand. Children waking up with memories of ancestors they'd never known. This was contagion, not of sickness, but of memory, of sight. And what happens when a system built on forgetting meets a spark of perfect recall? What is a witness? Not a spectator, not a victim, not even a believer. A witness is the one thing the system cannot contain, because a witness remembers before the story was written. The Morrison twins. They didn't tell secrets. They didn't expose sin. They simply remembered what others were forced to forget. And that is lethal. Because the world you live in today, the laws, the symbols, the borders, the oaths, they aren't built on truth. They're built on consensual amnesia. Do you understand what that means? It means every institution you trust, school, church, court, clinic, is only stable because you agreed to forget something essential about yourself. And every now and then, someone is born who can't forget. That's the witness, not just of events, but of original design, of the operating system before the virus was installed. When the twins walked through Pine Hollow, they weren't teaching. They weren't healing. They were restoring code. One glance, one touch, and the software of a person would begin to unravel. People recalled memories not their own. Buried truths rose up like weeds in concrete. Entire worldviews collapsed under the weight of unfiltered recognition. You want to know why that matters? Because the control system doesn't fear rebellion. It craves rebellion, feeds off it, designs it, manages it. But what it cannot survive is remembrance. Not nostalgia, not fantasy, but clear-eyed memory of who and what we were before the script. That is what the twins embodied. That is what they awoke. And that is why every ancient empire had the same protocol. Erase the witness, burn the scroll, bury the seer, mock the prophet, institutionalize the gifted child, call it delusion, label it disease, sanitize it with medicine, discredit it with science, contain it with shame. But here's the twist. For every witness erased, 100 more are born. Mem, Ori like fire, spreads in silence. And you, right now, you're not just hearing a story, you're remembering. If you've felt the echo, if something in you already knew this, then write this phrase in the comments twice to lock it in. I am the witness. I am the witness. Because once you say it, they can't take it back from you. Now brace yourself. The church is gone now. They tore it down in 1987. The official report said structural instability. Locals said it was something else. The demolition crew only lasted 3 hours. 5 men quit on the spot. 1 refused to speak ever again. But buried beneath the altar, wedged between the floorboards and the stone foundation, they found something. Not a relic, not a corpse. A page. Yellowed. Water damaged. Written in 2 hands. The first, unmistakably the script of Pastor William Phillips. Sturdy, methodical. A record keeper, even as his mind unraveled. He wrote, "If this is read by hands not bound to the covenant, may your eyes see only what you can bear. For the child has drawn what cannot be named, and I have seen what cannot be forgotten." The second hand was smaller, slightly unsteady. Childlike, but precise, almost surgical. It was Rachel's. She had drawn something. Not a creature, not a symbol, but a structure, circular, concentric, 11 rings. Inside the innermost circle, 2 figures, back to back, one smiling, the other blindfolded. It wasn't a map. It was a mechanism. A diagram of memory. The kind of memory that doesn't belong to one life, but to all lives. This wasn't prophecy. It was engineering. Rachel hadn't just seen truth. She had decoded it, rendered it in lines and ink, compressed centuries of erasure into one image, then hid it beneath the floor. Why? Because truth needs time bombs, not monuments. Because the real witnesses leave messages for the future, not in books, but in blood, in symbol, in the echo that shakes you when you know, without knowing how. Here's the secret they never wanted you to find. History is not linear, it's ritual. It loops until someone breaks the liturgy, until a witness burns the script, and walks off stage. That someone could be you. This isn't folklore. It's architecture. You've seen the diagram before, in dreams, in déjà vu. In the moment, a memory hits you like lightning and you can't explain why. You were never supposed to remember Pine Hollow, but now you do. The twins weren't the anomaly. They were the control group. We are the glitch. And if you've made it this far, your memory has already begun the process. You're not the same. Now go. Not back to sleep, but forward. Eyes open. Locks broken. Because the witness has awakened, and nothing stays buried forever.